Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? Let us say, for these purposes, that is, today is Thursday, June 27th, let's say, hypothetically, 2019. The only hypothetical part about it is 2019. This was actually recorded in 2015, and through our amazing foresight, okay, you know what's going on here. Hopefully nothing major like, I don't know. Well, for various reasons, we hope we haven't had a war break out or anything like that, anything that would make it look foolish for us to run with this pre-recorded show on this Thursday. Put together, we're going to make use of this time off, so to speak, and the pre-recorded show format to bring you up to date on a couple of stories that we ordinarily would like to have followed more closely in the past couple of weeks, but events have just gotten away from us. And maybe we can shoehorn a few into the shows to come that we might have brought to you on a Friday, perhaps on some other day. Just odd stories that have enough of a hook to make them interesting for our eclectic and eclectically minded audience, let's say. But we definitely have a couple of stories that we've followed for a long time or have discussed in the past that require some updating, and we'll use today's travel day and pre-recorded show to bring you up to speed on those things. There's a couple more really weird things too. We'll have to see what we can put together for you, but at any rate, we've got something of that gives us the opportunity to actually almost sort of kind of maybe almost plan a show, and that's pretty awkward for us, and it makes for a difficult situation. But here's what we've got lined up for you today. I definitely wanted to get on to... we'll start out with a couple of stories with NRA angles. That's well within our wheelhouse. But we'll kick this one off with a weird story I found in the New Yorker, which fits neatly into a couple of our verticals. One, the NRA, and two, the surprising prevalence of just outright cheating in the world of financial titans and other C-suite types that make you wonder why the rest of us bother to get up and go to work in the morning. And, that comes to mind, and We'll bring you this piece. I did record it separately from this introduction, which now, of course, will reveal to you exactly how we paste some of these shows together. And it occurs to me as I'm introducing the thing that I am about to say, through the magic of studio time travel, some of the very same things that I just told you in preparation for this story. But we got this one, and we have another NRA-angled story to follow up with. Then we launch into a completely different direction, but, a lot of Trump focus and a lot of stories that have been sort of loose threads up to now that need updating. They still, some of them just don't really neatly weave themselves into the fabric of what's going on in Trump world, but I don't know if there is a real fabric to it. At any rate, let's roll the tapes that we have put together for you and get you caught up. No more blah, blah, blah. Let's make with the tapes already. Who am I even talking to? Today's podcast also gives us a great opportunity to catch up on this story of great interest to us, but just difficult to squeeze in on a normal news day. This is a piece from the New Yorker, June 19th edition here. I don't know. Do they do that anymore? June 19th is the date line on the thing. Mike, I'm going to say Spies on this one because I knew someone growing up who had this surname, and even though it is spelled as Spies, S-P-I-E-S, my poor friend growing up had to endure every substitute teacher calling her by the last name Spies, and We all knew it was Spies, and people would groan and shout it out. But I don't know how Mike spells it, or rather how he pronounces it, so hope I'm not screwing it up too bad for you, Mike. Anyway, looks like a good piece here. Again, the New Yorker, the NRA's longtime CFO, believe it or not, was caught embezzling before joining the organization, former colleagues say. So isn't this amazing? Boy, you can just fail upward forever in the right wing, I guess. You're caught embezzling at some other previous employer and then apply for and get the job as chief financial officer and I guess for the NRA, that works. Now, isn't that interesting? My guess would have been otherwise, that with so many heavily armed employees, this is a place that would never get robbed. And yet, it seems to have taken place, and in fairly significant ways. So, okay, let me take a look at this story. Let's share it. Okay, in June 1991, this goes back a ways, Mary Hughes, the accounts payable manager at the Wyatt Company, an employee benefits consulting firm based in Washington, D.C., received a phone call from someone trying to reach the firm's chief financial officer, Wilson H. Phillips, Jr., who goes by Woody. Okay, good to know. The person was calling from Associates Relocation Management Company. What kind of even name is it? Associates Relocation Management Company, a firm in Texas which Wyatt frequently used to relocate employees. Wyatt, they said, owed Associates $45,000. Hughes checked Wyatt's system and determined that Associates had been paid. To prove it, she faxed the company a copy of the check. They called back less than 5 minutes later, Hughes recalled. They told me the check had not been deposited into their bank account. This does sound kind of fishy, but I've lost track of the players already in this one weird paragraph. Woody Phillips, apparently, according to the maybe this straightens it out. The caption under the photo of the NRA headquarters that illustrates this piece says, Woody Phillips, who was CFO of the NRA for 26 years, was once fired for embezzling more than $1 million, according to former colleagues. So now we know who's who. Mary Hughes is the accounts payable manager at the Wyatt Company, and she gets a phone call from someone trying to reach Wyatt Company CFO Woody Phillips, who later becomes NRA CFO. Okay, so the person is calling from Associates Relocation Management Company, which I guess that sound like a company you would hire to move employees from one office to another if the company is paying for the moves. So Wyatt Company uses Associates Relocation Management to relocate its employees. Very good. Okay. Wyatt owes. Okay, so Wyatt, or rather the Wyatt Company owes Associates $45,000, and so they're calling accounts payable manager Mary Hughes. Hughes says, according to their systems, they paid Associates already, and she sends them a copy of the check, and they call back and say, yeah, sorry, that check was never deposited into their bank account. So what happened? Okay, gotcha now. Instead, it had been routed to an account in Maryland. Now, they're in Texas, you see, and so routing it to an account in Maryland doesn't necessarily make very much sense. Hughes called the Maryland bank that had cashed the check and submitted a fraud report to recoup the funds. They gave me records saying who the account belonged to, Hughes said, and sure enough, it was Woody's. That seems so strange. In the next several hours, Hughes went through all of the payments Wyatt had made to Associates during the previous year, and she found multiple instances in which checks had been deposited into Phillips's account. All told, Hughes discovered that Phillips had embezzled at least $1 million from the firm. That is not good. I see why I'm getting so confused about this stupid story. Is the name of the company that's doing the paying is Wyatt, and that's a name that could very well be a person's name, and I'm like, Hughes, Wyatt, Phillips. The only one that makes sense to me is associates, but okay, I got you now. So somehow, how's that even happening, though? Well, maybe this will explain it. I'm confused. I'd love to know the mechanics. I love to know the mechanics of embezzlement so that I can start embezzling huge amounts of money from somebody. There's nobody I have enough contact with, but I don't know. I'll pretend I'm embezzling money from all of you who are donating it instead. How about that? So, okay. This is all going, so $1 million is being paid to a company in Texas by Wyatt Company, and somehow the CFO of Wyatt is getting the checks and cashing them. Phillips was quietly fired. I don't know why it has to be quiet. And no charges were brought against him. Now, why would that happen? According to Hughes, the firm, fearing that it would lose customers, chose to keep the matter quiet. Wyatt's doors would have closed if the company prosecuted him, Hughes said. I don't know about that. I mean, we were dealing with people's money and our CFO was stealing. Okay. Since then, Wyatt has gone through a series of mergers. It's now part of Willis Towers Watson, which declined to provide a comment for this story. What does Wyatt do? It's an employee benefits consulting firm. So, yeah, they thought they would go bankrupt and close their doors if all the clients who hired them to handle their employee benefits, benefit consulting, whatever, and their CFO is embezzling. That sounds like a bad bet, honestly. I mean, I guess if the news comes out, well, I don't know. What do you think? You're running a company and you hire the Wyatt Company to consult with you on employee benefits. You find out that the Wyatt Company's CFO is embezzling $1 million and that they didn't report it or have him prosecuted because they thought they were afraid that everybody would leave them. And now, of course, you say, well, now I'm leaving you because I found out that you don't prosecute your own officers when you catch them embezzling. Whereas, had you done that, I would have said, well, that's a black eye, but I'm betting there's no more embezzlement going on over there. That seems like an extraordinarily bad play. Well, now it's Willis Towers Watson's problem, and I guess they have to deal with it. What a strange thing to do. For years, it troubled Hughes. Oh, so sad. That Phillips got away with stealing money, particularly because he had then gone on to a long and lucrative career at the National Rifle Association, where they never steal anything because of all the guns around, where he served as the chief financial officer and treasurer for 26 years. After reading a series of reports published by The Trace and The New Yorker describing self-dealing and cronyism at the NRA during Phillips's tenure, Hughes decided to speak out. Enough is enough, she said a quarter century later. 3 of Hughes's former colleagues from Wyatt corroborated her story. All of them requested anonymity out of fear of retaliation. The only people who are afraid of getting punished in all this are the people who know, well, you know what, if you get involved in allowing an embezzler to walk away, I don't know. She probably had no decision-making power on that, but whatever. I reached out to Phillips. Our writer is the I, and this, of course, Mike Spees. Okay? That made me lose my place. I reached out to Phillips and the NRA for comment, and a spokesperson told me by email, the NRA has no knowledge of the matters in question and, naturally, is not at liberty to comment on any issues that do not involve the NRA. That's a long way of saying no comment. The spokesperson added, with respect to his relationship with the NRA, Mr. Phillips was a longtime employee, and he continues to provide value to the association and its members. Phillips did not respond to requests for comment. Hughes told me that the scale of Phillips's duplicity had surprised her. She said that she had confronted Phillips soon after she found out about the questionable deposits in Maryland. I said, Woody, how the hell did this check get into a bank account in Maryland? And he said, Mary, who else knows about this? And then murdered me. This doesn't sound like a good plan here, Mary. Hughes left Phillips's office and notified Wyatt's controller that the company had a major problem on its hands. That evening, after Phillips had left for the night, They waited around for that to happen. Hughes returned to his office. She found copies of fraudulent invoices that he had submitted to her under the associate's name, which she had paid. Now she saw that they were cleverly crafted fakes referencing legitimate activities that had never occurred. Then they're not, okay, well, they're legitimate in type, I guess. But they hadn't occurred, so they were not legitimate. It was a down payment on this, or the escrow on that, she said. The invoice for $45,000 that led to Phillips being caught was a genuine bill from associates. Phillips had apparently diverted the payment to his own account by mistake. Aha, a careless embezzler. Hughes later reviewed several years' worth of records and found that Phillips had been generating fraudulent invoices in the names of at least 2 other Wyatt vendors. The discovery left her badly shaken. I saw that he started the scheme almost as soon as he walked into the door, she said. Wow. Usually it takes a while for people to get comfortable thinking they're going to steal money and get away with it. Less than a week after Hughes uncovered the fraud, Phillips returned to Wyatt for a meeting with lawyers. According to Hughes, he immediately paid the company $500,000, but he owed at least $500,000 more. Phillips made monthly interest payments on his balance to Wyatt until at least 2001, when Hughes was laid off. So his separation is a layoff after all this. He's paying back $500,000 that he stole on the layaway plan while they lay him off. I don't understand this. This can't. Another why do we get out of bed and go to work story, I guess. By that time, Phillips had been overseeing the NRA's finances for nearly a decade. Philip Hackney, an attorney who used to work in the IRS chief counsel's office, told me that the disclosure of Phillips's past fraud should trigger a close review of his work at the NRA, you would think. A history of embezzlement means you can't have confidence in anything that he's done, Hackney said. Every transaction now merits serious scrutiny. You think? Phillips held his role at the NRA until 2018. According to annual reports filed with Massachusetts, Phillips, as the NRA's treasurer and chief financial officer, was solely responsible for custody of funds, distribution of funds, and custody of financial records. He was also one of 2 officials authorized to sign checks. Between 2005 and 2017, the years for which the organization's tax filings are publicly available, the NRA paid Phillips more than $10 million. Wow. By the way, what was the time frame of this? I've already forgotten. June 1991 that he gets caught at Wyatt. This has been going on quite a while. Okay. Phillips, despite his role at the NRA, has mostly evaded scrutiny as details of financial misdeeds at the organization have emerged. I guess he's not even the worst player there. In one internal NRA memo from 2018, which was obtained by the Trace and the New Yorker, the nonprofit's accountants singled out Phillips for payments, and that's in quotes here, quote, payments the NRA had made to his, quote, significant other, posing a conflict of interest. Okay, and self-dealing situation. William Brewer III, a lawyer who represents the NRA, previously claimed that the payment was legitimate. The NRA hired an IT consulting firm with links to a social friend of Mr. Phillips. Social friend or significant other. Okay, whatever. So that firm was interviewed and vetted by the NRA's IT department, and its engagement was reviewed and approved by the audit committee. All right. Phillips was also directly involved in another questionable business arrangement. While acting as the NRA's chief financial officer, he simultaneously held the same position at Member Drive. It's all one word, Member Drive, a short-lived marketing startup that brokered deals between membership organizations, like, say, the NRA, and businesses willing to pay royalties for their endorsements. One of Member Drive's top clients was the NRA. When the startup began to struggle, Phillips tried to cut costs. On July 16, 2001, he sent an email to his colleagues. The subject was, quote, voluntary salary reductions. And in his note, he informed the staff that the company's payroll would need to be reduced by about 25%. Those willing to voluntarily take the cuts, he said, would receive stock options in exchange. Very hot in 2001, I guess. He concluded, the commitment of everyone to our making Member Drive succeed is really appreciated, and these steps to manage our cash until a steady revenue stream is achieved should get us to a point where we all see the product of our sacrifices. You could see that going out from the CEO of a startup in those days, or really in any day. Two of Phillips's Member Drive colleagues, both of whom received the email, also had a direct connection to the NRA. One was, see if you can figure out the connection here, Susan LaPierre, a Member Drive executive and the wife of the NRA's executive vice president and CEO, Wayne LaPierre. The other was Holly Marcario, the spouse of Robert Marcario, who at the time was the NRA's director of membership. And so she's in the membership game. Member Drive, membership, the whole thing. Phillips, however, was the only official who worked for both entities. The NRA spokesperson told me that the nonprofit, quote, approved of the arrangement because the partnership benefited both organizations, adding it was determined there was no conflict of interest. Hackney, the former IRS attorney, said that Phillips's dual roles presented a glaring conflict of interest since Phillips could not fairly or effectively represent the financial interests of both organizations simultaneously. Instead, each organization should have had its own CFO. It strikes me as completely illegitimate just on its face, and it speaks of an absolute lack of controls, Hackney said. The guy's job was literally to watch the money. And that is it, actually, for that brief piece. That I guess there's probably more to come because it's pretty crazy. But I just thought I would throw that out there. You can see how that would be difficult to squeeze in on a busy news day. But always want to keep an eye on the financial and organizational collapse of the NRA. And just your basic, oh my God, Republican business types just steal everything that's not nailed down. One more in a series of stories. This is a great time for bringing up some other stories that just can't make the cut on other days, but really shouldn't be ignored. How about this one from Josh Rogan? And it even has an NRA angle to help us make the transition to the story. In the Washington Post, June 19th, State Department official didn't disclose ties to the boyfriend of Russian agent Maria Butina. Remember her? Are we saying Butina these days? I think we got away from the Butina version of these. But okay, here's yet more entanglements with this person. The State Department official in charge of U.S. arms control negotiations with Moscow. Not an important person at all, I'm sure. Well, this person and her husband had a years-long friendship with GOP operative Paul Erickson. You remember him? The former boyfriend of convicted unregistered Russian agent Maria Butina. And these are ties that this official did not disclose to her superiors or to Congress during her confirmation process in the spring of 2018. It would, of course, have been quite relevant then. Erickson officiated the June 2017 wedding of Andrea Thompson, the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security Affairs, and David Gillian, a former senior Australian Army officer. 3 administration officials and Erickson's lawyer have confirmed. At the time, Thompson was serving as National Security Advisor to Vice President Pence. Hello. 4 months before the wedding, Gillian, perhaps that's Jillian, I have no idea, it's just Gillian, had transferred Erickson $100,000, just to make that a little more complicated and disturbing looking. Again, 4 months before the wedding, Gillian had transferred Erickson $100,000, which federal officials allege Erickson stole from Gillian, FBI and court documents show. Thompson never disclosed these ties to her superiors until approached this weekend by this columnist, Rogan, the 3 administration officials said. How interesting is that? The wedding took place about 6 months before Erickson and Butina were publicly identified as being connected to Russian influence operations inside the United States. But by the time of Thompson's confirmation, allegations of the couple's influence activities had been widely reported. So just time out here. I want to go back and read this again, if I have this correct here. About the $100,000. Can I have that again, please? Yeah. So Erickson, he's the boyfriend, officiated at the wedding, which is unusual, let's say. Okay, 4 months before the wedding, Gillian, that's David Gillian, the Army officer, Australian Army officer who gets married here, transfers Erickson $100,000, which federal officials allege Erickson stole from Gillian. So Gillian had transferred. What, are they saying he had no knowledge of the transfer and Erickson just stole it, or he blackmailed it out of Gillian and Gillian agreed to give him $100,000? What is the story here? All right, well, let's continue on. Senator Robert Menendez, the ranking Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, told me, Rogan, that his panel will investigate Thompson's lack of disclosure to both Congress and the FBI. And how about that $100,000 thing, please? These reports about Undersecretary Thompson raise questions about how forthcoming she was with all relevant information during her confirmation process, Menendez said. I hope that any relevant connections implicating financial interests or to someone who our government has charged with being an agent of a foreign power, and by the way, the foreign power with whom you are charged with negotiating arms control deals. Hi, don't mind if I mention that, do you? Wow. So I hope that any relevant connections implicating financial interests or to someone who our government is charged with being an agent of a foreign power would have been fully reviewed and vetted by the FBI during the security clearance process and disclosed to the Foreign Relations Committee. It is not clear that happened. Seems fairly clear that it did not, I would think. Thompson's failure to disclose her contacts and her husband's business dealings with Erickson, business dealings, is viewed inside the administration as a serious lack of judgment. This administration views that as a serious lack of judgment. Amazing. Considering that her former boss, then National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, my God, was fired for lying about his contacts with Russian officials. Several administration officials told me Thompson should have disclosed these connections voluntarily, you think? Since she holds top security clearances and has worked for decades as a U.S. intelligence officer. Her failure to report this information, these officials suggested, represented an intelligence vulnerability that could have been used against her. And maybe already was. What is it? Tell me more about this $100,000. When a person who marries you gets into trouble with the Russians and your job is to negotiate with the Russians, you have to disclose that. Now, mind you, remember, this is the person who performs the wedding, not the person to whom you are married. But still, everybody with an intelligence clearance knows that, says a senior administration official. Half of your administration doesn't know that. But okay. Butina attended the Thompson-Gillian wedding in South Dakota as Erickson's guest, according to Erickson's lawyer, William Hurd. Butina did not have significant interactions with either Thompson or Gillian at the wedding, beyond greetings and congratulations, Hurd told me. The significant other of the officiant at the wedding, who's clearly a good friend of theirs, minus stealing $100,000 from them. I have my doubts about whether that was the extent of their contact. But okay. Paul Erickson had known Andrea Thompson and David Gillian for years. He considered them both friends and agreed to officiate at their wedding in 2017, Hurd told me. Maria Butina came to the wedding because Paul Erickson was dating her. If Paul had been dating a different woman, then that woman would have come to the wedding. What kind of nonsense is that? She's the one that went. He's not bringing a date as an invitee to the wedding. He's officiating the wedding. Okay. Stretches the credulity there, or tests our credulity, let's say. Anyway, The State Department declined to comment on the record. Thompson, through a State Department spokesperson, also declined to comment. Butina's lawyer declined to comment. Everybody did. Gillian and the McChrystal Group, the consulting firm where he now works, did not respond to requests for comment. McChrystal? As a career intelligence officer, he's going to get fired from there, I think. As a career intelligence officer, Thompson would have been required under updated executive branch regulations to self-report any significant unofficial contacts with a foreign national or any attempt by a foreign national to gain influence. There is no evidence to suggest Thompson or Gillian had significant interactions with Butina outside the wedding either. Sources close to Thompson told me that Erickson had known the Thompson family for many years in South Dakota. Thompson is not alleged to have been involved in her husband's business dealings with Erickson. Additionally, there is no evidence Thompson was deliberately untruthful with her bosses, federal investigators or congressional officials, during her vetting or confirmation process, minus this huge omission, which took place from late 2017 until her confirmation on April 26, 2018. They're giving her a huge pass here. In December 2017, after Thompson had left the vice president's office and was working at the State Department before being nominated for her current role, the New York Times revealed that Erickson had emailed top Trump campaign officials in May of 2016, offering to set up a high-level back channel with the Russian government led by President Vladimir Putin. Nobody wants to be left out of this thing. I've read so many stories of people who considered it their personal mission to set up a high-level back channel with the Russian government. There's dozens of them in the Mueller report, and this is just one more. It's incredible how many people appear to have taken it upon themselves to establish this connection. Under the subject line, Kremlin connection, sounds like a dumb subject line if you're trying to avoid detection, Erickson proposed that Trump could, quote, make first contact with President Putin's emissary at an upcoming event hosted by the National Rifle Association, of which Erickson was a longtime member. The planned meeting did not take place, according to the Times, along with everything else that Trump has ever tried to plan for himself. But according to federal prosecutors, this was just one of a series of actions Erickson took in cooperation with Butina to make connections in Republican political circles and set up meetings for Alexander Torshin, who was then a deputy governor of the Russian Central Bank. In July of 2018, the Justice Department unveiled a criminal complaint against Butina, charging her with conspiracy to act as an agent of the Russian Federation within the United States without prior notification to the Attorney General. Of course, the new Attorney General wouldn't care about that, but the old one might have. Probably not. In an accompanying affidavit, although she has been charged, so there is that. In an accompanying affidavit, the FBI claimed that U.S. Person 1, whom several reports have identified as Erickson, you always want to be married by an officiant, otherwise known as U.S. Person 1, right? Well, anyway, he worked closely with Butina to build her influence inside the United States and advance the interests of the Russian Federation. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence has opened an investigation into Butina, Torshin, and their activities inside the United States. The FBI also is reportedly investigating whether Torshin helped funnel Russian money through the NRA to help the Trump campaign. We think he did. Erickson has never been charged with any crime related to Butina, Torshin, or the NRA. It's the only one. In February, he was indicted in a seemingly unrelated matter, accused by federal prosecutors of defrauding dozens of investors related to a plan to build retirement facilities and housing for oil workers in North Dakota. According to an April 2018 FBI affidavit in that case, one of Erickson's last investors was Gillian. Erickson told David Gillian he would receive a return of between 25% and 75%. What? Within approximately 1 year, the affidavit alleges. In reality, the bank records indicated that David Gillian's $100,000 was not invested in real estate or anything else. The affidavit continues. Now we're getting the story here. In fact, that money was used to pay routine expenses and to pay off a previous investor. Wow, which makes it, of course, a Ponzi scheme. The previous investor, Congressman Marshall Sanford. Could it get any worse? Some of Gillian's money went to Erickson's girlfriend, Maria Butina, who didn't know them at all, but was getting paid by them for some strange reason. The criminal complaint against Erickson alleges he wired more than $20,000 to American University, where Butina was studying, 3 months after taking Gillian's money. Gillian is now suing Erickson in civil court in South Dakota regarding the investment. Good friends they are. Heard, Erickson's lawyer, has previously called the fraud charges against Erickson unfounded. To be clear, let's at least get clear, shall we? To be clear, Thompson's connections with Erickson are not a crime, and Erickson is innocent until proven guilty. Guess you got to say that 10 times in every one of these articles. Gillian is not accused of wrongdoing and is allegedly a victim of Erickson. Representative Elliot Engel of New York, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House, said Thompson's situation was symptomatic of larger staffing issues plaguing the Trump administration, to say the least. From clumsy vetting to chronic failure to fill vacant positions, it's no wonder there is such dysfunction in the executive branch, Engel said. The White House needs to get its act together to make sure the officials in charge of protecting our national security meet the highest standards and comply fully with all laws and regulations on disclosure. Wow. That is a wacky, wacky situation, and I don't think I've ever heard of this congressman who ended up getting, well, I guess not getting defrauded, but getting paid off in this stupid Ponzi scheme. Who believes that they were going to get 25 to 75% returns anyway? I guess former Australian Army officials somehow go in for this. What a weird story. We can't, directly turn it into anything, but it's just another one of those weird, stupid, murky stories that this one will come back. Eventually we'll figure this thing out. I just wanted to put that one on record. How stupid are these people? Amazing. So we got to look at this Congressman Marshall Sanford sometime too. He'll turn up again. You know that's the case. Here is a story I did not anticipate, being reported by TPM, Tierney Sneed at Talking Points Memo. Get this one. Will a Trump trade move create an election mess for overseas U.S. voters? I don't even know if this is necessarily the worst thing that comes out of this particular move, but what a surprise to me. I wasn't thinking about this one, so good catch on someone's part here. I don't know if Tierney dug this story up or had it fed over in some way or what, but the Trump administration has supported plenty of moves to make it harder to vote. But an under-the-radar action President Trump took last year as part of his trade war with China may be a case of him just stumbling into that outcome, election experts fear. Get this. Trump is threatening to withdraw from the international body that oversees global mail delivery. What? And that's a problem, of course, because it puts at risk the stability and reliability of the current system of sending and receiving mail internationally. Interesting that they would zero in this story on that, I guess, rather small portion of international mail that would involve absentee ballots from overseas Americans. But, to me, I think of all the other things that move by mail. And I guess that's what they were targeting, was those other things that move by mail. It just turns out to have this ancillary, maybe, benefit to them of creating havoc with the ballots. But of all the things that this stuff, international mail moves so seamlessly and has done so for so long, as you find out later in the article, it just never occurred to me as a place for Trump to create disruption. But I guess you now have to look for his intentional or otherwise disruption of everything that you have taken for granted. So it's a really interesting story in that respect. Any disruption, the story continues, to the International Postal Service, voter advocates say, could make an already difficult process of casting ballots for Americans abroad even more complicated. Among those who stand to be affected are members of the military overseas, about whom we know Trump does not care, whose ability to vote while serving their country has always been a politically sensitive issue. But so has shooting people on Fifth Avenue or raping columnists. So with those two out the window, I guess you can do just about anything. The White House told TPM it's working, quote, diligently, and that's rarely the case, to make sure that if the United States exits the 145-year-old International Postal Alliance, come on, the withdrawal would be seamless. At least they hope so. But the administration wouldn't provide details about its planning, particularly as it pertains to elections, or about who exactly has been working on it. Let me guess. Jared Kushner, Mick Mulvaney, Ivanka, Kellyanne Conway. Who knows? The lack of clarity is prompting anxiety in the election policy world. If the United States leaves the global mail delivery organization, it will happen just a few months before the 2020 primaries begin. I've had sleepless nights worrying about what will happen for voters that won't have the ability to return a ballot, said Tammy Patrick, senior advisor at the Democracy Fund who works with elections officials on voting administration issues. She and others in the voting space fear it will be more expensive for overseas voters to cast ballots if they have to rely on private carriers to do so, or that it will be altogether impossible for them to know for sure whether they'll be able to get their ballots submitted in time. Trump announced his intent to withdraw from the Universal Postal Union, which sets the rates and rules for international postal delivery across borders, last October. His objections to the current regime pertain to the subsidized rate China receives when sending packages out of its borders, which the administration says disadvantages American manufacturers. If the UPU does not allow the U.S. to set its own rates, the organization is gathering in late September for negotiations. The U.S. is set to withdraw from the 192-country organization altogether come October. What could go wrong with withdrawing unilaterally from a 192-country mail union that stood for 145 years? While trade experts have said that the administration's grievances with the system are legitimate, it's pretty amazing, they also say the impact of a withdrawal is unpredictable at best and could result in a more costly and less reliable international mail service, which is just what businesses want, don't you think? That's where the move could screw with U.S. elections, voter advocates warn. This action could seriously jeopardize the integrity of the overseas vote, said, oh my, this is an American person, but with a tremendous name. Susan, let's see, D-Z-I-E-D, Z-U-S-Z-Y-C-K-A. That's just the first, it's a hyphenated name. D-Z-I-E-D, Z-Uskia. I have no idea how you would pronounce that. My goodness. And then it's hyphenated. And the second part of the surname is S-U-I-N-A-T. Swinat? I have no idea how you would pronounce this. Sorry, but I can't help you with that one. That does not ring a bell. I think certainly need some Eastern European help on that one, it looks like. Zuzkia. Okay, well, I give up on that one. There's no point in trying to work that one out. However, it's unfortunate that we can't properly credit her because she's the president of the U.S. Vote Foundation, which sounds like an important group of people. It's a nonpartisan, which is also hyphenated, nonpartisan organization that offers voting assistance to overseas Americans. And I'll bet a lot of those overseas Americans have no problem pronouncing that surname on her either, because they have more and better experience with those names than I do. In addition to military members, those Americans include their families, U.S. contractors working internationally, other Americans whose jobs take them overseas, as well as students, missionaries, and participants in programs like the Peace Corps. Many of them rely on the mail, well, for a lot of things, but in order to submit ballots is what we're concentrating on here. with 19 states requiring that overseas ballots be sent back by mail only, just so that you get a better picture of this. I mean, it did mention up front that some people might choose to send their ballots back by private carrier, pay the additional fees of sending it by FedEx or DHL or one of the international carriers. But 19 states require that they be sent by mail, which, could create a pretty significant problem. A senior administration official who spoke to TPM on condition that the official not be named, as ordinarily referred to as anonymity, the official said the White House had been working diligently, and this time both words are included in the scare quotes. Instead of working, quote, diligently, they are now, quote, working diligently. And I think maybe more accurately, they were, quote, working diligently. And that the integrity of the U.S. elections is of the highest priority, which, of course, this White House never believed. The official said there has been, quote, intense preparation, unquote, for a potential withdrawal and weekly meetings covering, quote, all bases. That's a nice goal, but I don't think so. TPM provided the White House with a list of concerns, questions, and trade-offs flagged by outside election experts. Each of these issues are clearly on our radar screen, the senior administration official said. Oh, clearly. Who repeated the goal of a, quote, seamless transition. But the official declined to go into the specifics of how the administration was thinking through the various complications the withdrawal could bring for voting. And they never even bothered to say who was thinking it through, of course. Nor would the official go into more detail about who was being looped in on the election-specific plans. Nobody, no one, nada, I'm sure. We have been meeting at the White House on a weekly basis for months with all the stakeholders, including the Postmaster General's team, the State Department, and others, to ensure an absolutely seamless exit from UPU if necessary, the official said. Now, under a normal administration, you would be able to check whether or not the Postmaster General's team has been showing up at the White House on a weekly basis. Of course, they could be doing it by phone, but then you'd get the phone logs. But you can't get either of those things from this administration, so you might be stuck with what's quickly becoming, what I'm about to tell you is Waldman's Law on these things. It's not quickly becoming known as that, and it never will be known as that. But check the paperwork on everything. They say they're meeting on a weekly basis and have been for months on this. There would be phone logs. There would be visitor logs. I think that they're not doing it. But you'll never know because there's no paperwork from these guys. It's clear, or rather it's not clear, how often those meetings addressed the voting implications of the move. They probably didn't at all. I don't even think they had the meetings. But those implications until now have received almost no public attention. International mail delivery can already be slow for American voters abroad who face tight and sometimes impossible turnaround times between when they receive ballots and when they must send them out to meet their state's absentee voting deadlines. A 2016 Government Accountability Office report found that already some military and overseas voters who rely solely on mail delivery may not have enough time to both request a blank ballot and cast their vote. Turning to private carriers like FedEx and UPS to expedite ballot delivery could come at a financial cost to overseas voters, as the fees these carriers charge for quick international deliveries are not cheap. Anytime it becomes more and more expensive for ballots to be sent, that's like a poll tax, said Julia Bryan, the global chair of Democrats Abroad, the state Democratic Party for Americans living outside the U.S. The U.S. Postal Service declined to go into any specifics on its work with the White House on the issue. Its spokesperson said that the USPS was undertaking parallel efforts to ensure the continued exchange of international mail items, even if the negotiations to remain in the UPU are unsuccessful, an effort that includes addressing and prioritizing military mailing issues. It is the non-military civilians abroad whose voting rights elections experts are most worried about. The military currently operates its own postal service, the Military Postal Service Agency, or MPSA, that could possibly step up to help overseas service members mail ballots in time, voter advocates have speculated. That is, if all of the Military Postal Service Agency folks aren't stuck painting fences somewhere or doing some of the rest of the cleanup work for the idiot administration. But according to Patrick, that won't be of much use to any American voters who live off base, which could also include military spouses, U.S. contractors, and of course the millions of U.S. citizens abroad for civilian reasons. A study by the Federal Voter Assistance Program, an office under the Department of Defense which facilitates overseas voting, estimated that some 3 million citizens of voting age lived abroad in 2016, but only 6.9% of them voted. The study said that rate would be 37.5% if the obstacles to overseas voting were removed. FVAP, the Federal Voter Assistance Program, confirmed to TPM, Talking Points Memo, in case you forgot, that one of its representatives attended a previously unreported meeting, about the UPU with the White House last Thursday for informational purposes. That's what it says. That's usually why you would attend a meeting, but okay. The U.S. Elections Assistance Commission, a federal agency, I guess a different one, a federal agency, I think it's supposed to say here that, but it says that offers resources for state and local election officials, said in a statement that it, quote, is aware of the conversation surrounding this issue, unquote. I am aware you're talking about it. I don't know what you mean, but I hear you. And that should the withdrawal be implemented, quote, we will work closely with FVAP to assist and provide guidance for election officials across the nation to help navigate the change, unquote. No specifics whatsoever, of course. Under the MOVE Act, is that motor voter? I don't know, MOVE. Election officials are required to make available for overseas voters ballots that can be downloaded electronically to print and fill out. Many states offer some electronic method, either by fax, email, or online portal, for overseas voters to then submit that ballot. But 19 states do not, according to an analysis by the National Conference of State Legislatures, and 7 more only allow electronic transmission via fax. Maybe they could update that. Brian said her group is working with legislators of certain states, like New York, to relax those rules. But it's a slow legislative process to change those laws, she said. A pivot to online ballot submission alternatives is not itself a silver bullet, given the election cybersecurity concerns that have been raised in light of Russia's attack on the 2016 election. Good point. If that's the only option, how do we shore it up as well as possible? How do we make sure that it doesn't allow access to the greater system? Patrick said. The 2016 GAO study also found that overseas voters are often unaware of their options to download and submit ballots online. Furthermore, efforts taken by some states to make their election system more secure from cyber attacks have also made ballot access more burdensome for overseas voters. The overseas voters have reported being blocked from even accessing their state's election websites because they were using a foreign IP address. I could see how that would happen, according to the groups that work with them. According to the Philadelphia Inquirer, this happened in 2018 in Pennsylvania, a crucial swing state where in 2016 some 10,000 military members overseas and an additional 19,000 civilians abroad requested to vote absentee. New Mexico, Tennessee, Georgia, and Vermont were also among the states apparently blocking foreign access to their election websites, according to the Inquirer. Sometimes elections are a razor-thin margin. That's what it says. And a UPU withdrawal is a great way to knock out overseas ballots, said the woman working very diligently on behalf of American voting rights, whose name, unfortunately, I cannot pronounce. So, of course, that had to come back in the story before we were absolutely done with it. But, I appreciate being embarrassed a second time about that. It's an interesting story, though. Just one of 1,000 moving parts you're going to have to keep your eyes on in the days to come. It's time now to catch up on the story of Jerry Falwell Jr. and the pool boy. We really have not discussed that one much. I have two stories here. I had two stories. I'll give you some background on what I've done with this thing. I had a story from the Miami Herald, which is the more local source, and then one from the New York Times. And we're always reading from the New York Times. I thought I'll read you the story from the Miami Herald. We'll get a better, closer up, more local, on-the-ground view of things here. And I read it, and I put a half hour into the reading of it, and then I was so dissatisfied with the coverage and the conclusion that I decided to take a look at the New York Times coverage of it. And in my initial skim of it, I think the storytelling is much better. I hope it doesn't have as much of a dud of an ending as the Miami Herald story. I'm really actually quite annoyed at the way the Miami Herald handled this story. Too bad. I don't know. Anyway, the New York Times appears to have done a better job of it, and I will offer you this. The evangelical, the pool boy, the comedian, and Michael Cohen walk into a bar. You get the idea. Here, Jerry Falwell Jr. defied expectations when he supported Donald Trump in 2016. Now, details are emerging about behind-the-scenes maneuvering before the endorsement. And it seems like that may end up being as much, if not more, of the... If none of it rises to the level of scandal in the end, then the more interesting story. Anyway, although there are some very weird background details to all this, still unresolved in all of this, I think, is just how does the pool attendant at the hotel impress Jerry Falwell and his wife so much that they're flying him around on a private jet? I just don't know. Well, anyway, New York Times has Francis Robles and Jim Rutenberg on the story here. June 18th is the date on it, so it's been some time. Senator Ted Cruz, he's the big loser in all this. Senator Ted Cruz was running neck and neck with Donald Trump in Iowa just before the caucuses in 2016. But his campaign was expecting a last-minute boost from a powerful endorser, Jerry Falwell Jr. Mr. Falwell was the chancellor of one of the nation's largest Christian colleges, Liberty University, and a son of the Reverend Jerry Falwell Jr. Sr. I'm sorry, you all know him. I've mangled his name, although it was funnier as Reverend Jelly Falwell. Hey, Jelly, how you doing? But you all know him and regard him with some suspicion as Reverend Jerry Falwell Sr., the televangelist and co-founder of the modern religious right. Months earlier, this is really not going well. Months earlier, Mr. Falwell had provided Liberty's basketball arena, remember this, for Mr. Cruz's formal presidential announcement, and required that the student body attend, giving the Texas Republican a guaranteed audience of thousands of cheering young religious conservatives. With the caucuses now fast approaching, the senator's father, Rafael Cruz, remember him, an evangelical pastor who had taken the lead in wooing Mr. Falwell, he didn't woo him enough, not like the pool boy did, alerted the campaign that Mr. Falwell had pledged to endorse his son. How weird, how strange that he then didn't go and do this. By the way, it also strikes me as strange that didn't the Mercers also initially back Cruz and then switch to Trump? I wonder if there's an interesting story in that somewhere. But when the time came for an announcement, Mr. Falwell rocked the Cruz campaign and grabbed the attention of the entire political world. He endorsed Mr. Trump instead, becoming one of the first major evangelical leaders to get behind the thrice-married, insult-hurling real estate mogul's long-odds presidential bid. Also, he's a rapist. So I'd throw that in there. Mr. Falwell, who is not a minister and spent years as a lawyer and real estate developer, said his endorsement was based on Mr. Trump's business experience and leadership qualities. Well, that's a bad idea, but whatever. A person close to Mr. Falwell said he made his decision after, quote, consultation with other individuals whose opinions he respects, unquote. But a far more complicated narrative is emerging about the behind-the-scenes maneuvering in the months before that important endorsement. That backstory, in true Trump tabloid fashion, features the friendship between Mr. Falwell, his wife, and a former pool attendant at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach. The family's investment in a gay-friendly youth hostel, purported sexually revealing photographs involving the Falwells, and an attempted hush money arrangement engineered by the president's former fixer, Michael Cohen. What do you know? The revelations have arisen from a lawsuit filed against the Falwells in Florida. The investigation into Mr. Cohen by federal prosecutors in New York, and the gonzo-style tactics of the comedian and actor Tom Arnold. Over the last 2 years, Mr. Arnold has fashioned himself an anti-Trump sleuth and crusader, working to dig up evidence of past malfeasance on television and in social media. In that role, Mr. Arnold befriended Mr. Cohen. How? Why? Who had lately, become a vivid, if not entirely reliable, narrator of the Trump phenomenon, and then surreptitiously recorded him describing his efforts to buy and bury embarrassing photographs involving the Falwells. How odd. I wonder, how does the timing of Cohen's flipping on Trump figure into all of this? That attempt, Mr. Cohen says on the recording, came months before he brought Mr. Falwell to the table for Mr. Trump. Until then, he adds, none of the evangelicals wanted to support Trump. There is no evidence that Mr. Falwell's endorsement was part of a quid pro quo arranged by Mr. Cohen. Indeed, the relationship, if any, between the endorsement and the photo episode remains unclear. But the new details, some of which have been reported by news outlets including BuzzFeed and Reuters over the last year, show how deeply Mr. Falwell was enmeshed in Mr. Cohen's and Mr. Trump's world. And they add another layer to one of the enduring curiosities of the Trump era, the support of that the president has received from evangelical Christians, who have traditionally demanded that their political leaders exhibit family values and moral character. I'm not certain that they've actually demanded that their leaders exhibit them, but they've wanted to beat other people up over them. But I don't know of any who've actually demonstrated family values and moral character, so that's a little shaky. Anyway, Mr. Falwell's father forged those words into weapons against the Democrats after he co-founded the Moral Majority political movement, which propelled Ronald Reagan into the White House and made religious conservatives a vital constituency for any Republican who would be president. By the time Republicans cast their first votes in 2016, Mr. Trump was starting to show surprising strength among some white evangelicals, but with Mr. Falwell serving as the torchbearer of his father's legacy, his endorsement became a permission slip for deeply religious conservatives who were attracted by Mr. Trump's promises to make America great again, but wary of his well-known history of infidelity, his previous support of abortion rights, and his admission that he had never asked for God's forgiveness. All things that are supposed to be major for them, but okay, whatever. And by the way, I just think it's interesting that this all gets engineered by a guy who's not a minister and not an evangelical preacher, but just the son of one who runs his father's Christian university as a business, a way to make a living, and then jets around to various Florida getaway spots. Like, why is he able to make endorsements that count for evangelicals? I don't know. It's just purely the name. They're very weird people. For those of the more fundamentalist variant of evangelicalism, the Falwell family and the Falwell endorsements are an important factor, said Jim Guth, G-U-T-H, a political science professor at Furman University who has long studied evangelical politics. Sorry, sir. Mr. Cruz still managed to win in Iowa, but Mr. Trump soon won South Carolina with strong evangelical support, sending him on a solid path toward the nomination. 3 years later, Mr. Falwell remains an unwavering Trump supporter. Last month, he went so far as to suggest that the president deserved an extended term as reparations, very funny, for time lost to the Mueller investigation. In turn, he had He has had entree to the White House, providing input on education policies that stand to benefit liberty. That's in keeping with lots of Trump practices. The Falwells declined to comment for this article. Mr. Falwell has said there were no compromising photographs, and the person close to them, who would speak only on the condition of anonymity, said the Falwells, quote, did not know anything about Mr. Cohen's alleged efforts, unquote, on their behalf. Mr. Falwell's endorsement of Mr. Trump, the person said, was made after careful consideration. Mr. Cohen, he said, did not try to exert any inappropriate pressure. Mr. Falwell began to grow close to Mr. Trump and Mr. Cohen after Mr. Trump came to speak at Liberty in Lynchburg, Virginia, in 2012. Mr. Cohen, who was working to connect his boss with important political constituencies and their leaders for a possible presidential run 4 years later, came along for the trip. Mr. Trump lacked the religious bona fides of those who typically filled the school's speaker lineup, but he was the star of the top-rated Apprentice reality show, which had no reality involved, and Mr. Falwell admired his career in real estate because he didn't know how bad it really was. As it happened, the Falwell family was exploring a real estate venture of its own. Earlier that year, Mr. Falwell and his wife, Becky, had stayed at the Fontainebleau, the grande dame of the Miami Beach hotel scene, apparently, and a somewhat unlikely vacation spot for the chancellor of a university whose student code prohibited short skirts, co-ed dorm visits, and sex outside of biblically ordained marriage. Once a glamorous hangout for John F. Kennedy, Frank Sinatra, and Elvis, the Fontainebleau was now the stomping grounds of the Kardashians, Paris Hilton, and Lady Gaga, known for allowing topless sunbathing, and for a cavernous nightclub that one travel guide described as 30,000 square feet of unadulterated fun. Techno music was pumped out at its 11 pools, where waitresses in polka dot swimsuits served drinks, and white uniformed male attendants brought fresh towels and positioned umbrellas for tips. The Falwells struck up a conversation with one of those pool attendants, Giancarlo Granda. Mr. Granda, then 21 and the son of immigrants from Cuba and Mexico, was working at the hotel while studying finance at Florida International University. The Falwells, according to the person close to them, were impressed with Mr. Granda's ambition. Soon he was hiking and water skiing with them in Virginia. Within months, they were offering to help him get started in business in Florida. Unsure how to capitalize on the offer, Mr. Granda consulted a close high school friend, Jesus Fernandez Jr., whose father, Jesus Fernandez Sr., had worked in Miami real estate for decades. The Fernandezes would later assert. Together, they directed Mr. Granda to a South Beach youth hostel that was for sale. The building also housed a restaurant and a liquor store. Mr. Falwell and his wife agreed to help finance the purchase after a meeting in Florida with Mr. Granda, the real estate agents, the younger Mr. Fernandez, and his father, who was facing a $34 million bankruptcy. Negotiations were underway when Mr. Trump visited Liberty, and the Falwells invited Mr. Granda to fly up for the occasion. A photo taken on a private plane, reviewed by the New York Times, shows him holding a copy of Trump, The Art of the Deal. Mr. Falwell introduced Mr. Trump to Liberty's students as one of the greatest visionaries of our time, oh my goodness, who single-handedly forced President Obama to release his birth certificate. That's not even true, is it? Mr. Trump shared his secrets to winning in business and life. Ready for his secrets? They're here, actually. Get even. Can you imagine that? And always have a prenuptial agreement. Though he quickly added, I won't say it here because you people don't get divorced. What a winner. Off stage, he posed for pictures with the Falwells and shook hands with their special guest, Mr. Granda. How odd. In 2013, the Falwells completed the deal for the Miami Hostel, which rents beds for as little as $15 a night, bunking 12 people to a room. The hostel became known as one of South Beach's best budget party hostels and is sometimes listed as gay-friendly. The Falwells' involvement came to light in a 2017 Politico article by Brandon Ambrosino, a Liberty graduate. He reported that the hostel featured a sign on its front gate declaring its house rules: no soliciting, fundraising, politics, salesmen, or religion. Inside the Falwells' hostel, the stench of general decay and cigarette smoke is overpowering, Mr. Ambrosino wrote. Tourism pamphlets included one for Tootsie's Cabaret, including, here this quote, 74,000 square feet of adult entertainment and, all caps, full nudity, unquote. 74,000 square feet, that's twice the size of the Fontainebleau's nightclub, which is unadulterated fun. On a recent overnight visit, the sign forbidding politics and religion was gone, and there were no visible flyers for adult clubs. The hostel was tidy and relatively quiet, common for this time of year, Miami's off-season. A warning was posted that the hostel was not responsible for accidents on the premises, especially if you are drunk, it says. Real estate records show that an LLC called Alton Hostel bought the hostel and its building for $4.7 million in cash. Wow, in cash. By the way, a creatively named LLC. What does this LLC do? It owns the Alton Hostel. What's it called? Alton Hostel LLC. Within weeks, Alton Hostel secured a $3.8 million mortgage from Carter Bank and Trust, the Virginia-based bank the Falwells had long used to finance and expand Liberty University. The source of Alton Hostel's initial full cash payment is not known, but Mr. Falwell would later say in a sworn affidavit that his family's financial contribution to the deal amounted to a loan of $1.8 million, including $800,000 for renovations. The Falwell's son, Jerry Falwell III, who goes by Trey and was 23 at the time, was listed as manager of the LLC. Mr. Granda was later added as a co-manager. In his affidavit, Mr. Falwell said his wife was also a member of the LLC. So that's interesting. They bought it for $4.7 million in cash, then took out a $3.8 million mortgage on the property, which I guess, did they then use that to pay themselves back? Or we don't know where the $4.7 million in cash came from, so we can't say for sure, but I assume it came from them and they then paid themselves back with the mortgage. An odd way of handling things. Around South Beach, people involved in the deal regarded it as the sort of thing Miami's young and good-looking could luck into when they encountered wealthy visitors. Miami is a very touristy place, one of the brokers, Roberto Bracho, said in an interview. If you are in the right place at the right time, you can hit the jackpot. That kind of explains, sort of, maybe, kind of, almost, how this thing happened here. The situation quickly deteriorated, it says. The Fernandezes believed that they had been promised an ownership share. The Falwells denied making any such promise, and in his affidavit, Mr. Falwell sought to minimize his involvement, saying that as an advisor on the deal, he could not have given them a stake. The Fernandezes threatened a lawsuit. Mr. Cohen, in this next section here, interesting. The section is entitled Rigging Polls, Fixing Problems. Curious, yes? Mr. Cohen had kept in close touch with the Falwells after Mr. Trump's 2012 visit. He would later say he viewed them as family. Man, it was pretty quick and easy. Mr. Cohen even turned to a Falwell lieutenant, Liberty's Deputy Chief Information Officer at the time, John Gauger, Gauger, as he worked to build Mr. Trump's political profile. Mr. Gauger also ran his own consulting firm, Redfinch Solutions. Redfinch is sort of one word there with a capital F in there. Mr. Cohen hired Redfinch, look at this, to manipulate 2 online polls in Mr. Trump's favor. One in 2014 by CNBC and another in early 2015 in the Drudge Report, Mr. Gouger told the Wall Street Journal in January. At around the same time, Mr. Cohen and Mr. Trump were arranging with the National Enquirer and its chief, the Trump ally David Pecker, to buy and bury stories about Mr. Trump and women that could harm his political prospects. Mr. Cohen's confessed role in 2 such deals, one with the Enquirer to silence the former Playboy model Karen McDougal, the other with the pornographic actress Stormy Daniels, whom he initially paid out of his own pocket, contributed to the 3-year sentence he is now serving at the federal prison in Otisville, New York. By Mr. Cohen's account, the Falwells appeared to be in need of just that sort of help. By late 2015, the lawsuits over ownership of the hostel had devolved into a fight over compromising photos, according to several people involved in the case. It was understood that between Mr. Granda, the Fernandezes, and their lawyers, 1 or more people were in possession of photographs that could be used as leverage against the Falwells. And so Mr. Cohen tried to play the fixer for his friends. In a recent legal filing, Mr. Fernandez Jr. said he was forced to change his name because of the case. Okay, he became Gordon Bello. Of course, because that's what anyone would do. His father, Mr. Fernandez Sr., became Jet Bello, with 2 T's. Their name changes took place after Mr. Cohen intervened. What? That seems, well, I mean, they kept the same surname. They certainly wanted to never be mistaken as anything but father and son. But imagine you can change your name to anything, and you decide Jet Bello is going to be your name. I don't know why they thought that was cool, but I imagine he's like, yeah, I always wanted to be a Jet. And what about Bello? I'm not really sure why I picked Bello. There's always room for Bello is the only explanation, I guess, that I can think of. Mr. Cohen described his involvement in his conversation with Mr. Arnold, which was first reported last month by Reuters. There's a bunch of photographs, personal photographs, that somehow the guy ended up getting. Whether it was off of Jerry's phone or somehow maybe it got airdropped or whatever the hell the whole thing was, Mr. Cohen told Mr. Arnold in the recording, which Mr. Arnold shared with the Times. Mr. Cohen never identified the guy. These are photos between husband and wife, Mr. Cohen added, joking that the evangelicals are kinkier than Tom Arnold. He explained, I was going to pay him and I was going to get the negatives and do an agreement where they turn over all the technology that has the photographs or anything like that, and he copies negatives. Where are you from? But the payoff never happened, he said, and the guy just either deleted them on his own or what have you. I doubt that. The person close to the Falwells said that Mr. Cohen was neither their lawyer nor their fixer, and that they had not been aware of his alleged actions regarding photographs until parts of the recording were released. Mr. Cohen, who declined interview requests, told Mr. Arnold that he had been trying to protect Mrs. Falwell. Even though she has a very nice figure, oh jeez, he said on the recording, nobody wants their private photos published. In the process, he said, he had obtained one of the photos of Mrs. Falwell and still had it. So much for everything getting deleted, right? With a few weeks to go before the Iowa caucuses kicked off the primary season on February 1st, 2016, Mr. Cruz, remember him, was steadily racking up high-level endorsements. He was banking on strong evangelical support to push him past Mr. Trump in the state. In mid-January, Mr. Cruz's father reported back to his staff that Mr. Falwell had committed to endorsing his son, according to two people involved in the campaign at the time. A news release was prepared, they said, while aides began vetting Mr. Falwell's background as is standard for presidential endorsers. In the before times, I guess. But really, they didn't know all about Falwell Jr. at that point? Okay. Signs that something was amiss. Well, we didn't know about the photos anyway. Signs that something was amiss came shortly afterward when Mr. Trump arrived at Liberty for another speech. Mr. Falwell introduced Mr. Trump as a man who, quote, lives a life of loving and helping others as Jesus taught. In no way, shape, or form is that true. Despite the generous introduction, the appearance seemed an unmitigated disaster for Mr. Trump. He betrayed his ignorance of the Bible by referring to a passage in 2 Corinthians rather than 2 Corinthians, everyone remembers that, and loosely used the words hell and damn. Wow, that's scary. But for the evangelicals, I guess it is. Even so, rumors began to spread that Mr. Falwell was leaning toward Mr. Trump. Rick Tyler, a senior Cruz advisor, called Mr. Falwell to say that if there was ever a good time to make his support official, this was it. That was when Mr. Falwell told him he had learned that he could not make any endorsement in the primaries. He said his board wouldn't allow him to endorse, Mr. Tyler said in an interview. Around that time, Mr. Falwell was coming under heavy pressure to get behind Mr. Trump, according to someone who spoke to Mr. Falwell then. A few days later, Mr. Falwell announced his endorsement of Mr. Trump, calling him a successful executive and entrepreneur, a wonderful father, and a man who I believe can lead our country to greatness again. In an email, the person close to the Falwells said the Liberty Chancellor had never seriously considered endorsing Mr. Cruz and did not know how the campaign had gotten that impression. What's more, he said, Mr. Cohen did nothing more than ask Mr. Falwell to endorse Mr. Trump. Though Mr. Falwell said he was making the endorsement as a private individual, not as head of the university, the decision roiled the Liberty community. Some graduates and students expressed stunned disappointment. One of Liberty's trustees, Mark DeMoss, an alumnus and a longtime confidant of Mr. Falwell's father, told the Washington Post that Mr. Trump did not exhibit Christ-like behavior that Liberty has spent 40 years promoting with its students. Does anybody exhibit Christ-like behavior, though? Should you really aspire to that? Well, among evangelicals and other Christians, I suppose, I'll leave it up to you. Sounds presumptuous to me, but I'm not one of you. After clashing with Mr. Falwell and other board members, by the way, he resigned, this Mark DeMoss did, in a statement that he provided at the time and which is linked in the article here. Oh, look at this. So scrolling down, here is a picture of the 2012 speech at Liberty University. I see Michael Cohen sitting on stage there behind him, and also Michelle Bachmann is there, strangely enough. Anyway, the article continues at this point. At the Cruz campaign headquarters, the reaction was anger and shock, Mr. Tyler said. Something changed, obviously. The relationship between Mr. Falwell and Mr. Trump would prove mutually beneficial. Mr. Trump sought to make Mr. Falwell his Secretary of Education, Mr. Falwell has said. After he declined, he disclosed that he would serve as an outside advisor to the administration on education policy, a role in which, Mr. Falwell indicated, he would call for rollbacks of regulations governing accreditation. Gee whiz, why? Recruitment and student borrowing. A lot of what we sent them is actually what got implemented, he told the New York Times Magazine last year. Mr. Falwell, in turn, has remained one of the president's most vocal defenders, even in the rare moments when other Republicans wouldn't, as in August of 2017 when Mr. Trump said there had been very fine people on both sides of the violent white nationalist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, that resulted in the murder of a young counter-demonstrator. That month, with settlement talks involving the hostel at an impasse, the Fernandezes, now the Bellows, filed a written complaint. The complaint, first reported by BuzzFeed News several months after it was filed, asserted that verbal offers were made to Granda, to provide him with financial assistance. Mr. Falwell, the complaint read, indicated that he wanted to help Granda establish a new career and build a business as the Falwells' relationship with Mr. Granda, quote, evolved. In his sworn statement, Mr. Falwell said the family had made Mr. Granda a co-manager of the LLC in return for serving as its local representative. Mr. Falwell saw the hostel as a good opportunity to introduce his son and Mr. Granda to real estate investing, according to the person close to the family. Mr. Granda, he said, received only a modest income and a financial stake that was of limited value because of the property's heavy debt, which it didn't initially have, but then they went and tacked on to everything, All right, now back to Tom Arnold and all of this. Mr. Arnold's anti-Trump antics have largely consisted of his public search for more recordings like the Access Hollywood outtake, in which Mr. Trump boasted about grabbing women's genitalia, as they put it here in the New York Times. Last year, Mr. Arnold even got his own television show on the Viceland network, The Hunt for the Trump Tapes. It produced no new tapes during its 8-episode run. How do you get a run if you don't have any I don't know. But it did help lead to the recording of Mr. Cohen discussing the Falwells. So there is that. Mr. Arnold first met Mr. Cohen last June at the Lowe's Regency Hotel in Manhattan as Mr. Arnold was taping his show. Their meeting didn't result in a Cohen appearance on the program, but Mr. Cohen agreed to a photo with Mr. Arnold, which went viral on Twitter, and the two stayed in touch. Early this year, after noticing the articles in the Journal and BuzzFeed about Liberty, Mr. Cohen and the Fernandez suit, Mr. Arnold began suggesting on Twitter, without presenting any evidence, that the Falwells had been in a sexual relationship with Mr. Granda. Those tweets led Mr. Cohen to call Mr. Arnold and deny any such relationship. He then described his efforts to help with the photos. That conversation, 2 months before Mr. Cohen went to prison, left more questions than answers. Mr. Cohen has publicly said nothing more. No photos have surfaced, and it's unclear how many there are. In all, 3 people said they had seen at least one photo, though their descriptions varied and could not be verified. Nor is it certain whom Mr. Cohen hoped to pay off. He never mentions the Bellows, formerly the Fernandezes, or their lawsuit on the tape, but makes reference to the pool boy, leaving open the possibility that the photos came from Mr. Granda and that Mr. Granda had shared them with the Bellows. Then again, the guy to whom Mr. Cohen refers could be some other person entirely. Mr. Granda, now working toward a graduate degree in real estate at Georgetown University, a considerable step up, referred questions to his lawyer. The lawyer, Aaron Resnick, said his client had never interacted with Mr. Cohen, whom he called a convicted felon and admitted liar. That's straight out of the Trump White House. He said any suggestion that Mr. Granda was the person referred to on the tape would be false, and he bristled at what he called tabloid fodder directed at a first-generation Hispanic American. That seems like I don't know why they wouldn't direct it at a first-generation Hispanic American, but okay. In a statement to the Times, the senior Bello said he and his son had been respectful to the Falwells, despite the sensitive details surrounding this case. Whatever that's supposed to mean. It was Mr. Cohen, acting as their lawyer, really, who, he said, who had, this is Bello saying Mr. Cohen acting as the Falwell's lawyer. I assume he wasn't acting as the Bellows lawyer, right? It was Mr. Cohen acting as their lawyer, he said, who had revealed his client's indiscretions. He said the pending lawsuit prohibited him from offering more details about the photographs or why he and his son had felt compelled to change their names. That's the story I want. Mr. Falwell has granted only one interview about the Arnold recording to Todd Starnes of Fox News Radio, telling him there were, quote, no compromising or embarrassing photos, and saying, We never engaged or paid Cohen to represent us in any legal or other professional capacity. The new details about the lead-up to his endorsement of Mr. Trump have not affected Mr. Falwell's continued enthusiastic support. Earlier this month, Mr. Falwell chastised a pastor who was embroiled in a controversy over his decision to pray for Mr. Trump during the president's surprise visit to his church in the Washington suburbs. Oh, yes. The McLean Bible Church. Really? So Falwell chastised this pastor, suggesting that the pastor was being too accommodating of critics. Mr. Falwell directed a tweet at him reading, "Grow a pair." A crude reference to the pastor's masculinity. Thanks for explaining that, New York Times. After the post drew criticism on Twitter as being beneath a religious leader, if he even is one, Mr. Falwell responded that he did not need to adhere to strict religious standards. Boy, anything goes now, I guess. "I have never been a minister," he tweeted, saying that it was up to the students and faculty of Liberty to keep the schools strong spiritually. Wow. He added, "While I am proud to be a conservative Christian, my job is to keep LU successful academically, financially, and in athletics." Okay. And an abrupt end here, too, in this article. Just like in the Miami Herald one, which I eventually was so offended by the abrupt ending that I opted not to share it. Because, well, it didn't do a very good job telling the rest of the story either. But this one did a much better job on the story, but nobody seems to have a conclusion here, which leads me to believe that there's some juicy stuff that has been chopped out of the story by maybe the legal departments at both of these papers. How interesting. All right, well, I think we're up to speed on it. This may end up being a dead end entirely. I don't know, but there's just too many weird players involved in it, and this seemed like as good a time as any to get caught up on the details of that mess. Holy cow. All right. Good luck, Bellows, with the name change. Love to get that story one day. Let's see if I can fit this quick one in here in a 10-minute window I have inadvertently created for myself in patching this show together. I have a piece from The Intercept by Ryan Grimm, which is not offered up as a Joe Biden bashing piece. I can't say that that's not why Ryan offers it that way. Not why I'm reading it. I'm actually more interested in the legislative history that he's bringing up, but it may be a salient point in evaluating some of the supposed promise of Joe Biden's candidacy and his promise of being able to deliver bipartisan compromise. It's entitled here, "Joe Biden Says He Can Work with the Senate. Last time he tried, Mitch McConnell picked his pockets badly." So Ryan writes it up this way: "As the year 2012 wound down, Democrats hopefully eyed what looked to be one of the last opportunities for genuine legislative progress in a divided government. The party had just stomped Republican Mitt Romney at the polls in a post-Occupy campaign that centered on economic inequality. Democrats picked up 2 seats in the Senate, expanding their majority to 53 and adding Elizabeth Warren to their ranks. Though Democrats won more House votes nationwide and picked up a net of 8 seats, Republicans held on to the newly gerrymandered lower chamber. The hope was tied to the expiration of the tax cuts passed under George W. Bush. Republicans, despite losing the popular vote and taking the White House in 2000 by a 5-4 Supreme Court decision, moved swiftly to pass an enormous tax cut tilted heavily toward the rich. To do so, they used a parliamentary procedure that could get around the filibuster in the Senate, known as budget reconciliation. We've gone through that before. The cost of doing so, however, is that the policy enacted through reconciliation must expire in 10 years' time. By the time the legislation was set to expire in 2010, the Tea Party wave had shaken up Congress. The Obama White House urged Senate Democrats to extend the tax cuts, arguing both that they had a difficult political hand and also that extending them in an unstable economic environment was good policy. White House economic advisor Larry Summers told a private meeting of Finance Committee Democrats that allowing the tax cuts to expire would, quote, tank the economy. According to a Senate aide at the time, The ensuing negotiations would involve a whole cast of characters from throughout the White House and across the aisle in the Senate. Its resolution, though, ultimately hinged on the intervention of then Vice President and now leading contender for the presidency, Joe Biden. He has cited his ability to work with Republicans and conservative Democrats, up to and including segregationists, as we'll all remember, as one of his top qualifications for president. This makes his role in the tax cut fight perhaps his most significant involvement in policymaking as vice president, critical to examine closely. And up close, it doesn't look good. The Senate agreed to a 2-year expansion at the end of 2010, but only after Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont delivered his viral 8-hour old-fashioned filibuster, sort of. I think we discussed at the time why that wasn't really one, but close enough. On the Senate floor, and he used it to draw attention to the fiscal giveaway. The extension meant that the tax cuts were now expiring in 2012 rather than 2010, and in order to repeal all of them, to go over what the media began calling the fiscal cliff, all Congress had to do was nothing. That, Harry Reid told me in an interview for my new book, Ryan says, was precisely his plan. How do you like that? I wanted to go over the cliff, said Reid, the Senate Majority Leader at the time. I only barely remember. I remember the terminology. I can't remember the circumstances of it, what was supposed to happen. But, well, let's see if we can't uncover that. I thought that would have been the best thing to do because the conversation would not have been about raising taxes, which it became. It would have been about lowering taxes. In other words, let all the rates go up and then bargain with Republicans to reduce taxes just for the middle class and the poor. I see. I got you now. Then Minority Leader Mitch McConnell similarly knew the difficult position going over the cliff would put him in, and in preliminary talks with Reid, he agreed to let rates on people making more than $250,000 per year go back up, if to slightly lower levels than pre-Bush. McConnell aides would later say that McConnell had not firmly conceded anything, that's certainly possible, and that negotiations weren't finalized. Or that they were, but he was going to renege on them. That's also a possibility. Sounds more like it. McConnell had a strong sense that Reid intended to go over the cliff and put Republicans up against a wall. Told that Reid had since confirmed that he indeed wanted to go over, a Republican operative said he found the admission unsurprising. That's consistent with his body language at the time, said the operative, who wasn't authorized to talk on record about the negotiations. He knew he could blame it successfully on the hard right in the Republican Party. Negotiations had reached an impasse. It wasn't just spin. Reid was ready to go over. Reid felt like he had successfully pushed McConnell to the brink, buoyed by House Speaker John Boehner's inability to get his unruly conference to agree to anything. It was now Sunday, December 30th, and Democrats only had to hold out until Tuesday to find themselves in a dramatically improved political position, as the dawning of the new year would mean the tax cuts expired and automatically reverted to pre-Bush levels. At that point, it would be Republicans left pleading for rate cuts. In desperation, McConnell reached out directly to Biden, calling him on the phone and explaining that Reid was refusing to be reasonable. Over the course of the day, McConnell and Biden struck a deal. Biden gave Republicans everything they wanted in exchange for fixing the fiscal cliff problem, the GOP operative recalled. Remember, of course, it is a GOP operative recalling that. Biden, who served in the Senate from 1973 to 2009, and as vice president from 2009 until 2017, is now locked in his third Democratic primary contest for the presidential nomination. The reason he has such good relationships with Republicans in the Senate is he never hesitates to put aside the highest priorities of his base in the interests of compromise, the Republican operative said. That's also how you make life difficult in a primary. On the morning of New Year's Eve, Reid was still feeling good about his position. That was until he saw McConnell take to the Senate floor and announce that he'd been in talks with the vice president, they were progressing well, and he was hopeful that they'd have legislation to move by the end of the day. As details of the deal began leaking out, progressive Democratic senators were floored. A large group of them, including Sanders, Senators Sherrod Brown of Ohio, Jeff Merkley of Oregon, Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, Al Franken of Minnesota, and Tom Harkin of Iowa, stormed over to Reid's office. The deal was awful, they told Reed, and it had to be stopped. Reed told them what had happened, that it was out of his hands, and that McConnell had gone around him to Biden. He said he was working on improving it and would be in touch throughout the day. None of the senators had any business scheduled. It was New Year's Eve, after all, so Sanders invited them back to his office in the Dirksen building. The Hart building has a popcorn machine, so Harkin asked his staff to bring some by. The crew ended up spending several hours together in Sanders' office, thinking through potential strategies of opposition and waiting to hear from Reed. Instead, one senator's phone rang, and it was Joe Biden, calling to sell the deal he had cut. In classic Biden fashion, he offered a 10 to 15-minute soliloquy, a meandering argument that largely boiled down to, "You can trust me. I'm your friend. This is a good deal." The senator could barely get a word in before the conversation ended. Moments after he hung up, another cell phone rang. It was Biden again. Unaware that the group was all together, Biden proceeded to call each of them one after the other, delivering the same spiel. Biden's flimsy argument and his filibustering style of delivering it became a running joke among the senators. No one found it remotely persuasive, said one person in the room. Biden's own characterization of his lobbying efforts didn't differ substantially from the recollection of those in the room. Asked that day by reporters what he had said to wavering senators, he replied, "I said, 'This is Joe Biden, and I'm your buddy.'" Ultimately, it fell to Reed to drag the progressive senators into line. Once it was clear that the White House was on board with Biden's deal and McConnell was all in, that meant there would be at least 70 or 80 votes for it. The progressive bloc could vote no, but it would only send a message of discord and have no effect on the outcome, Reed told them, coaxing them to support the deal he himself loathed. In the end, all the progressive senators except Harkin voted for the deal, and it passed 89-8. Years later, Reed still regrets how it went down. If we'd had gone over the cliff, we'd have had resources to do a lot of good things in the country. Infrastructure development, always on the list, I guess. But it didn't work out that way, Reed said. Letting all the tax rates go back to pre-Bush levels would have yielded the Treasury around $3 trillion over 10 years. Instead, the deal ultimately brought in around $600 billion, or would have if taxes hadn't been slashed again by Republicans in 2018. Without the deal, taxes on dividend payments to the rich would have been set at 39.6%. Under the terms of the deal, they would be set at 20%, meaning that the super wealthy would be paying lower tax rates on their passive dividend income than some working people would pay on their salaries. I asked Reed how Biden defended the strategy that day. "It wasn't one I agreed with," he replied politely, "so you'd have to ask some of his people." His people declined to comment. And that's it. That wraps it up. Thought that you might find that one interesting and a good reminder of what it was like in those days. Okay, now to close things out, I think I alluded to this in one of the earlier stories. I think I promised you the story of Duncan Hunter, which is breaking a little later, a little closer to our actual airing date for this show. Let me grab you the Daily Kos write-up of it. Jen Hayden took care of this one for the front page over the Daily Kos, just to give you the best general overview of the story, which you've no doubt heard some about by now. Prosecutors say Republican Congressman Duncan Hunter embezzled campaign funds to pay for extramarital affairs. Paid for all sorts of things, mostly related to extramarital affairs. It's just another amazing story of another amazing entitled a-hole who thinks that campaign funds and leadership PAC funds and et cetera, for that matter, probably even taxpayer funds at some point, are just various pools of money given over to the entitled class to just do whatever the hell you want with. And this time he's caught. And in the meantime, I think he tried to blame his wife for all of this stuff, too. What a class act. So Jen writes it up this way. California Republican Duncan Hunter has apparently been living high on the hog, using campaign donations to wine and dine several women. And yes, of course, he's a family values type of guy. And people have pointed out his website, marriage, sanctity, the whole 9 yards. Wine and dine several women who he is not married to, while the woman he is married to, Margaret Hunter, may end up testifying against him in federal court. Congressman Hunter is currently facing more than 60 federal charges of fraud for misusing campaign donations. During his first court appearance in August 2018, he stunned observers when he threw his wife under the bus. And here an excerpt from that appearance, I guess, in which he says, "When I went away to Iraq in 2003, the first time, I gave her power of attorney. She handled my finances throughout my entire military career, and that continued on when I got into Congress," Hunter said on The Story. She was also the campaign manager, so whatever she did, that'll be looked at too, I'm sure. But I didn't do it, he added, because of how classy he is. What a guy! Earlier this month, Margaret Hunter cut a plea deal with prosecutors and agreed to cooperate and testify as prosecutors see fit. She may serve up to 5 years in prison. That's bad news for Duncan Hunter because Margaret can waive spousal privilege and testify against him. And after the case prosecutors laid out today, who could blame her? In the case they made in Hunter's trial today, I guess that's the stage we're at, Hunter has been a serial adulterer carrying on affairs with at least 3 lobbyists, a staff member from his office, and an official from the Republican National Committee. Prosecutors laid out evidence Hunter used campaign funds to finance all the affairs: dinners, ski trips, alcohol, Uber service to and from his meetups with other women. I guess you name it. Wow. There was one other eyebrow-raising detail in the government filing. Prosecutors included a section entitled, quote, "additional potentially secretive conduct," that is so salacious that they would not name it in open court. You can read the details below, and we'll do that. But prosecutors say whatever bombshell it is they are sitting on could potentially ruin a jury pool. What the hell? Well, here's the excerpt here. Additional potentially secretive conduct. In addition to pursuing intimate personal relationships, Hunter improperly used campaign funds to pursue other clearly non-work-related activity during get-togethers with his close personal friends. That is pretty gentle. As with the evidence described above, the United States has offered to craft a factual stipulation that would eliminate the need to introduce this potentially sensitive evidence at trial. With respect to this evidence, Hunter has indicated he may seek such a stipulation. The parties are discussing specifics. Public disclosure of this additional activity runs the risk of improperly tainting the jury pool before the trial begins. Accordingly, in the event the parties are unable to reach a stipulation on this matter, the United States respectfully requests that the court grant leave to 1. File a motion on this topic outside of the previously set deadlines, and 2. File the statement of facts related to this motion under seal. Well, interesting. Jen concludes here for his defense, Hunter has been all over the place. USA Today reporter Brad Heath was live tweeting the details, and maybe we'll take a look at some of those. He noted Hunter claims he's broke despite a $170,000 per year salary. Prosecutors noted he and Margaret overdrew their bank account 1,100 times in 7 years, accumulating $37,000 in overdraft fees. He does live in California and Washington, D.C., both expensive zip codes for certain. But come on, any way you slice it, this man has no business managing taxpayer dollars, that's for sure. And living in expensive zip codes doesn't mean you start embezzling campaign funds to pay for your cigarettes, ski trips, and numerous adulterous affairs. Hunter also made an effort to get the case thrown out because 2 of the government's attorneys met Hillary Clinton once upon a time and got a photo with her. In his motion to dismiss the case, Hunter's attorney argued he was being targeted because he endorsed Trump. What a tool, and what a way to conclude the piece there, Jen. You're right on with that one. She mentioned Brad Heath had taken a look through the filings. He included all sorts of screenshots of them along with his commentary on them, and I think that's probably one of the best rundowns of the case that we can fit into the time we have remaining, I think. The Justice Department, he begins, wants a judge to prohibit Representative Hunter, you know how he tweets, is using the Twitter handle, but wants to prohibit Congressman Hunter from, quote, offering evidence or argument concerning alleged political biases or motives of the prosecution team, or making other comments that could poison the pool of potential jurors. A lot of poisoning of jurors going on in this case, or at least potentially. This refers to what Jen was talking about at the end here, that he's trying to get the case dismissed, and I guess he didn't, but he wants to try and argue before the jury that he was targeted unfairly in this prosecution because two of the people on the prosecution teams were apparently interested in meeting Hillary Clinton at some point and presumably supported her in the campaign. The screen grab is, it's pretty straightforward language that they use to try to make this argument. In a series of public statements that have been widely broadcast throughout his district, defendant Duncan D. Hunter, this is from the prosecution, by the way, has repeatedly insisted that his prosecution is politically motivated. Rather than address this allegation to the court, Hunter has raised them in public events or statements to the press that are then broadcast to the pool of jurors who will be called to serve at his upcoming criminal trial. Because these allegations are irrelevant to the question of Hunter's guilt and risk infecting the jury pool, the United States respectively moves to 1. Preclude Hunter from offering evidence or argument concerning alleged political biases or motives of the prosecution team, and 2. Admonish Hunter and the defense to refrain from making improper public statements that could poison the jury pool, or the pool of potential jurors, as they put it. Brad's tweet thread continues. Representative Hunter, a Republican, says his prosecution by the Justice Department, run currently by Republican appointees of President Trump, is actually the deep state and was trying to rig the election their own way. The excerpt reads, on August 22, 2018, Hunter gave an on-air interview to local San Diego news. During the interview, he claimed, "This is modern politics and modern media mixed in with law enforcement that has a political agenda. That's the new Department of Justice." He added, "This is the Democrats' arm of law enforcement." The Trump DOJ, really. "That's what's happening right now. It's happening with President Trump. It's happening with me. I think they've used every dirty trick in the book. They can try to have a political agenda as our law enforcement, as a U.S. government, as we've seen with former FBI agent Peter Strzok, and with the FBI and DOJ have been what they've been doing, I guess is what he's trying to say. With the FBI and DOJ have been doing. Okay. Let them expose themselves. Oh my God, don't do that in this context. For what they are, a politically motivated group of folks. This is politics, unfortunately. And he can barely speak, unfortunately. Hunter accused the, quote, deep state Department of Justice of trying to rig the upcoming election against him. This is political, period. This is the U.S. government. What I would call the deep state, or folks in the U.S. government that don't care what the election does. They want to rig the election their own way because they can't beat me in a real election. Well, I doubt it. President Trump, a Republican, previously criticized his attorney general, also a Republican, for allowing the prosecution of 2 Republican congressmen, Brad reminds us. That's true. And he includes the Trump tweet, which reads, incredibly enough, 2 long-running Obama-era investigations of 2 very popular Republican congressmen were brought to a well-publicized charge just ahead of the midterms by the Jeff Sessions Justice Department. 2 easy wins now in doubt because there is not enough time. Good job, Jeff. That a tweet from September 3rd, 2018, incredibly enough. Really doing everything he can to interfere with the prosecution and the election. So it's a proven thing that Trump intervenes or tries to intervene in prosecutions for purely political purposes. Once again, a vicious case of projection, I guess. All right. The next of his tweets here is Brad Heath tweeting, the Justice Department filed a notice saying Duncan Hunter illegally used campaign funds to pay for intimate encounters with several women, and prosecutors want a judge's permission to tell jurors about those romances. They sound pretty juicy. Let's see. There are a couple more here. Maybe I should skip the excerpted screen grabs. DOJ says Hunter took a lobbyist skiing near Lake Tahoe and charged it to his campaign. Prosecutors said their relationship, quote, blossomed beyond a mere friendship. Ooh-wee. They say he even charged the campaign for his $7 Sam Adams when he arrived in Tahoe. Gee whiz. Pay for something, dude. DOJ says Hunter took the unnamed lobbyist on a double-date road trip to Virginia Beach with another member of Congress. Wow. He charged the campaign for their hotel room and bar tab. DOJ says Hunter used campaign money to take another woman, a house aide with whom he had been intimate, for drinks. Then he charged the campaign $21 for an Uber back to his office at 1:49 a.m. Just the perfect time to head back to the office. DOJ says Congressman Hunter billed his campaign $42 for an Uber he engaged in after he engaged in intimate personal activities. That's a quote. With a lobbyist at her D.C. area home. That night, prosecutors wrote, was not about business. Well, I guess not, although he may have said he was all about business that night. I don't know. DOJ said Representative Hunter billed his campaign for an Uber in 2016 after he spent the night at the home of yet another Washington lobbyist, where they engaged in intimate personal activities unrelated to Hunter's congressional campaign. Yeah, I think so. They may have you on that one. Let's see. There's a couple more of these tweets here, too. DOJ says there's other sensitive conduct. We discussed that one. That's the one that's so sensitive that they can't discuss it out loud for fear that it would taint the jury pool. I'm really intrigued by that. A lot of people thought that one was something special on Twitter, and they've been discussing it. Let's see. Well, we're almost time for our outro music here. Let's see if we can't squeeze in one more before we get to it. Perhaps not surprisingly, federal prosecutors filed a notice saying they might call Congressman Hunter's wife as a witness against him. And I guess, no, that's not all that surprising. Okay. Can we get to the end of the tweet thread here? Let's see. Here are the filings, the links to them. Meanwhile, Hunter wants a court to throw out the charges against him because two officials in the U.S. Attorney's Office attended a Hillary Clinton fundraiser in 2016 and wanted a photo with her. Big, large portion of screen grab there, if you're interested in the details of that one. The argument for why that requires dismissal is thin, he says. He argues he was prosecuted in retaliation for endorsing Trump. But in support of that, he argues only that the two assistant U.S. attorneys on the case appear to have supported Clinton. That claim is here, too, and available for you through the link. It doesn't sound like it's working out. Hunter also argues that lying on campaign disclosure forms might maybe be a crime, but that it should be up to the FEC and definitely not obstruction because that would chill, quote, the First Amendment rights of every member and candidate for Congress. Here's that argument, provided in a link as well. Hunter also argues that 3 of the 60 charges against him are unconstitutional because they would require a court to interpret a House rule. Well, we'll see whether he gets away with that one. And let's see. There's a little bit more here, and I think we might even be able to squeeze 1 or 2 more in after this brief message.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Well, this one sums it up pretty well. We'll leave with this one. And DOJ says Congressman Hunter, despite drawing a $170,000 salary as a congressman, was basically broke. So little compunction did they feel about stealing to make ends meet, they began to use campaign funds for such basic expenses as cigarettes, gasoline, and groceries. Take that.